Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm joining you from the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, and this is one of our webinars from the Radical Old Idea series. I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to Dr. Katherine Trebeck, who is joining us from Australia. She is a fellow at Edinburgh University at the Edinburgh Futures Institute and will be the writer in residence. And she's also the founder of the Wellbeing Alliance in Scotland. So I'm delighted to be able to speak to her from Australia. If you do have any questions for Katherine, please drop them in the Q&A box and we'll get to those towards the end of the conversation. You can also join in and give us your contributions via Twitter as well. And for those of you who'd like to do that, the handle is @Finance4Change with the number 4 between finance and change, or you can use the hashtag Radical Old Idea. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Katherine into the webinar and we'll get started.
Hi, I think I'm off mute. And
you're off mute.
And I'm not sure I can go my video. Okay, you can see me?
We can see you. We can see you. Yeah, live from Australia. So Katherine, welcome. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about your book, The Economics of Arrival. For those of you who don't have it yet, this is what it looks like. You can see my little notes in it. I'm really delighted to speak to you. And I wondered if I can maybe start with referencing something in your book that speaks to me in particular and relates to the radical old idea. So on page 196, for those of you following along, Katherine talks a little bit about one of my favorite people, Adam Smith, and helpfully points out some of the misinterpretations. And in particular, this one is about the concept of the free market and the case for economic growth. And that Adam Smith, didn't even know what GDP was. It wasn't something that had been invented then. And it really speaks to me. Before you left, we had a coffee and a conversation, and we talked about the radical old idea. And it was really you that brought to me the definition of radical. I always think of radical as like being a purple haired old lady, which is what I'm going to be on a picket line. But you brought home to me that that's not necessarily what it means. So I wonder if we can open with that, and then we'll get into the heart of your book.
Sure. And hi, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's lovely to, in a way, be back in Scotland via this Zoom call. So really, really nice to be here. And yeah, the term radical, so often it's used to dismiss something as being heretical or impossible, or just too radical. But actually, one of the roots of the meaning of radical is actually going to the root of something, going to the root cause. And I think that really speaks to a lot of the thinking that I do about the role of the economy is how can we go to the root cause of some of the challenges that we see facing our world today? How can we look upstream and how can we see what's the source of the problem? So much of social policy, a lot of charitable work is what I describe as downstream, absolutely necessary, but it's essentially helping people on planet cope with the fallout of the current economic system, sort of their collateral damage, and we sort of patch and repair and put sticking plasters over that damage and pat ourselves on the back, saying that's a solution when we've helped someone survive and cope. And actually, it's not good enough just to do that. So that's absolutely vital in the short term. But I think the more we can, often I say, channel your inner 3-year-old and ask, but why? But why? What are the challenges? A 3-year-old's going to be really annoying, but why? But why? We have to be like that and not just take at face value why there are more people sleeping rough in shop doorways. Why are people going to be having to turn up to warm banks this winter? Why are we hearing Earth system scientists say that we're pushing past more and more tipping points and look upstream to the root causes there and take action at that point? And that's where I think the economic system change movement in all its diversity really comes into play, because they're saying we have to redesign the economic system in a way that deals with those problems at source.
Thank you. And so there's 2 little snippets there that I've written down already. I love taking notes as you're speaking. So I'm getting to the root cause, reminding us that it's not about doing things that are unachievable, but actually looking backwards and questioning how we got here in the first place. and channel your inner 3-year-old. I'm going to be taking that one into the weekend with me. Thank you. I wonder if we can talk about the economics of arrival, and what does it mean to have an economy that has arrived?
Sure. So there's two pieces of the book. So it's almost like a dual concept. The first is this idea of arrival, and then the counterpoint to that is this idea of making ourselves at home, because that's what you do when you've arrived, isn't it? When you get to the end of a journey, you then settle in and you make yourself at home. You don't pause, you improve things, you look after things, you take care of things, but you don't keep running faster and faster. And so that metaphor really, really spoke to me. And actually, it was a very fleeting conversation with my co-author, Jeremy, when we first met at a coffee shop in London. And he just almost just flippantly said, those GDP rich countries, those sort of wealthy, industrialized countries of the global north, need to recognize that they've arrived. And so as someone who was in London, so away from Scotland where I was living at the time, but also someone who was away from the place I was born, that idea of arriving home and the sense of peace and that sense of homecoming, that beautifulness of a sense of arrival really spoke to me. And so I said, well, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful idea. We need to write a blog about this. And actually, we never wrote the blog because we said, maybe it's a discussion paper. Maybe we should write a discussion paper. And we never wrote the discussion paper because it became a book. And so we really sort of took this idea of arrival almost by daring to ask this question that's often forbidden in how we talk about the economic system is, has the journey of economic growth, has this idea of economic development as we conceive it, actually got a destination? Has it got an end point? Or are we really hanging on to this idea of infinite economic growth? And the challenges with that idea of infinite economic growth, and of course, it's only in economics that people think that constant growth is a good thing. In all sorts of other spheres of life, people really get intuitively that growth to a point is great, but after that point, it's really problematic. And so when you apply this idea to economics, you really start to come up against these realities. That one, the reality of planetary boundaries, that we live on one finite world, our natural home, and we're seeing, I think, in our news headlines and in the stories from communities that are most affected by the impact of environmental breakdown, just what's happening when we push as humanity. And of course, it's a huge amount of inequality in that pushing. But when collectively we're pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle, she's hemorrhaging. So we're seeing that. There's also the reality of this idea of diminishing marginal returns. And anyone who has studied economics will be aware of this idea of diminishing marginal returns. But essentially, you get less bang for your buck the more you have of something. And that applies at an individual level. For example, if you're eating ice cream, first couple of mouthfuls are going to be fantastic. By the time you get to your 30th, you're going to be a bit queasy. Well, maybe 50th for me because I love ice cream so much. But so it is with economic growth at early stages of economic development, whether that's a country or a region that needs more. And that could be in parts of Scotland as well. When growth is used well, when it's used to go to those areas, those communities, those families that don't have enough, so when it's pro-poor, when it's used to invest in collective institutions, our health systems, our education systems, for example, then you do get good returns in terms of various aspects of social progress that we might care to measure: life expectancy, infant mortality coming down, literacy rates rising. But those returns start to tail off. And we can look at that in various different measures, whether it's the genuine progress index or the social progress measure, or whether you map GDP per capita against life expectancy or even measures of subjective well-being. You see those returns start to tail off. So that's another reality. We're also then, so much of what growth is being used to spend on is often spending on dealing with that collateral damage that we talked about earlier. And in Scotland, this term, the failure demand, is often talked about. There's how much of what government spends on is in response to our collective failure to create good lives for people. And again, once you start reading newspapers and government announcements with this idea of failure demand in the back of your mind, you'll see it everywhere, whether it's repairing after a flood or an extreme weather event, or rebuilding after huge bushfires, as we had here in Australia a few years ago, or repairing after massive floods that are now happening in Australia, whether it's a lot of the criminal justice system, a lot of accident emergency at our hospitals, a lot of treatment for obesity or asthma that's exacerbated by pollution and so on. You just see so many examples of spending money that, if we'd been smarter as a society, if we'd created contexts where people felt safe, where they were healthy, where they had enough, where we didn't have to spend top-up wages and be plugging the gap because people's salaries weren't, or wages weren't paying enough to live on, then you wouldn't have to spend so much. So this idea of that growth, it's actually Herman Daly, who passed away just a few days ago, he talks about uneconomic growth. And maybe we need to have that, allow ourselves to have that conversation as well. How much of this growth is actually uneconomic because it's in response to our collective failure? So there's some of the concepts that I think take you into the territory of being able to question this idea that maybe we have arrived, maybe we're entering that terrain of diminishing marginal returns, maybe even we're entering the terrain of uneconomic growth. And then that begs that second question. Okay, if we've arrived as a society, that certainly doesn't mean that everything's sorted, certainly doesn't mean that everyone has enough. And so that then takes us into the second part of the idea in that book, which is, how do we make ourselves at home? And that means ensuring that we share and cherish the resources much better than we do. And that's a very, very different conversation towards the economy than one that's where the economy is designed for more and more economic growth.
Such beautiful concepts. I'm going to probe you some more on the concept of what does it mean to be at home, and I wonder if you might, so maybe talk about the book first and what you cover, but then I wanted to ask you a deeply personal question about how it feels for you. So for those of you who follow Katherine on Twitter, you'll know that she spent a lot of time in Scotland as the founder of the Wellbeing Alliance, but has left our sunny shores. Oh no, hang on. No, Scotland's not sunny. Hang on. Has left our shores to go to the sunny shores of Australia, your home. And so there's a lot in here, not just the arrival you mentioned for the economic system, but a departure for you and an arrival somewhere new. What are you seeing in your work now that you have that perspective of shifting again? And what is resonating more with you on reflection now that you've arrived home? Or is Scotland home? Or is Australia home? Or do you have two?
I think, and I'll take the personal one first, and then we'll come back to the idea of what an economy that's making itself at home means. So the personal side. Yeah. So after 17 really fun, incredible years in Scotland, where I made such good friends and really completely loved Scotland, it got to the point where I felt I've really got to see how things are in Australia again. And having not visited Australia because of COVID for almost 3 years, 3 years away from family and so on, and just needed to come back and see how things are. And things have changed a lot. So I'm back in my hometown where I grew up. So it feels incredibly familiar. But having been away for 17 years, I feel like an outsider. There's different people in government. There's different think tanks out there. There's different people playing for, the rugby team, the ones I used to cheer for 2 decades ago. My friends have got older and some of them have got wiser. And it feels very different. And of course, there was a big change of government in Australia just a few months ago. And I think that's really shaping the opportunities to have different conversations here. So that's really, really exciting. And I'm seeing much more progress in some of the conversations that you and I would be interested in than I had even dared to hope for. I mean, a lot of businesses absolutely on the front foot around addressing climate change and really envisaging their role as a key player in creating a more sustainable economy. public opinion way ahead of where previous government was in terms of climate action. The government still too timid, but I don't know if anyone's been following the Australian sort of electoral system, but there's now huge number of independents in Parliament, which is not really meant to happen the way the Australian system is set up, and they're really pushing the government to go further. So hopefully we'll see some prominent changes here. But it's beautiful just being reminded by how crazy the wildlife is in Australia. I had a kangaroo jump past my window here just this morning, and hearing the crazy birds. It's nighttime here, so you're not hearing them, but if this was 6:30 in the morning, you'd be hearing the sort of shrieking of cockatoos and galahs, and just really appreciating the incredible wildlife of this country. And so I'm enjoying that process of starting to make myself at home again. But Scotland will always be home as well. And given my role at the University of Edinburgh, I'll be back as often as I possibly can. So it's definitely not goodbye. And I think I'm in one of those really very, very privileged positions of having a sense of home in two places. And what incredible fortune that is. And so in terms of the idea of an economy that makes itself at home in the sort of the macro sense, that's essentially an economy that shares and cherishes its resources rather than just plundering them and extracting them. So it really focuses on making sure that everyone has enough, and also making sure that the economy, production and consumption systems operate in a way that looks after what nature has given us and takes care of that, rather than seeing it as something to extract from, use, and then throw out. So things like a more circular production and consumption systems. So the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, really reuse, repair, recycle, all those, making sure we have circular design. Plenty of examples in Scotland of companies that are really putting their shoulder into that conversation. But also a really key part of this is how do we design the economy to provide for enough people? And so questions around ownership of firms. How are business models designed? Are they just out to make a quick buck, very short-term profit orientated, or are they seeing perhaps being commercially viable as a vehicle rather than the goal in its own right? Almost like the micro equivalent of seeing GDP as a goal in its own right. What's the micro equivalent of that at the firm level? And so there's a whole plethora of different business models that are emerging that are ways to embody that. So whether it's the B Corporation movement, or economy for the common good, or worker co-ops, or community enterprises, or social enterprises, there are all sorts of different models, but they're all about, yes, being commercially viable, but doing so for a reason that's got social and environmental goals at the forefront. And since writing the book, actually, I've started to get my head around all the different plethora of changes you would need to create that sort of economy, which we're increasingly describing as a well-being economy, an economy that delivers for the well-being of people and planet. And you'll imagine that there will be a suite of shifts that you'll need in terms of how we design urban infrastructure, how we do our farming, how we do decision making, tax and incentive systems, policy instruments, how we do energy, and so on and so on. Like, there's hundreds of thousands actually of changes at all levels, right from the supranational up to the very micro, down to the very micro. And how I get my head around all those different changes is to think of it like a jigsaw puzzle, all pieces together. Every piece is necessary. And we were all doing, those of us who are lucky enough to work from our kitchen tables during COVID, so many people were doing jigsaw puzzles. And so what's the trick with a jigsaw puzzle? You start with the corners. And so I think about just sort of how we get our heads around that plethora of changes that you need for a wellbeing economy, for an economy that makes itself at home as the 4 Ps of this jigsaw puzzle. And so they are purpose. So what is it that the economy is set out to deliver? Things like the National Performance Framework that we have in Scotland, great example of that. Outcomes-based budgeting that, say, the New South Wales government here in Australia is really pushing for, would be good examples of that. For-purpose business models would be another example. So purpose is a key. What is it we're focusing on? And key in that is seeing economic growth as a means rather than an end in itself. So being fair weather friends of growth rather than its ever faithful followers, asking what do we need more of in our economy that's aligned with the economy that meets the needs of people and planet. And actually, if we're really honest, what sort of sectors and activities in the economy do we need to power down? So really taking a more qualitative view of what is it we want in the economy, thinking about direction and composition of growth rather than just the rate that is so often reported in terms of GDP. So that's the first corner. The next corner is around prevention. And that gets to what we were speaking about earlier, that so much currently of what's spent on is just responding to failure, patching up, repairing, sort of helping people survive and cope, which is absolutely necessary. But I also think at this stage of human development, with all the wisdom and creativity and sort of values and passion that humanity has, surely we can do better than just patching and repairing. And so raising our gaze and looking at the root causes and taking action there, so you're not having to respond downstream. And so, for example, the more circular our economy is, the fewer beach cleanups we're going to need, the more renewable energy we have making up our energy system, the less carbon capture, sequestration and storage we need, the more well-paying, decent jobs we have that have enough hours, the less top-up wages we're going to have to provide through our welfare systems, and so on. Those sorts of things, really taking action at source. The next P is pre-distribution, which is a bit of a clunky term, but I think one of the most exciting concepts. And it's essentially saying, rather than letting the gap between rich and poor open up so much, and then maybe slightly mitigating it through taxes and welfare transfers, with all the challenges and political machinations and tax evasion and avoidance that goes with that, can we get market outcomes to yield more equal outcomes in the first place? So through pre-distribution. So things like worker cooperatives, the community wealth building agenda, true cost accounting would be the sort of things you'd see in that cluster, the jigsaw puzzle. And then the final one, and then I'll stop talking. The final one is people powered. How do we really make sure that individuals, communities feel in control, feel that they're at the forefront, and it's their ideas and values. And we're really attending to those needs to make sure that this is one that's not a top-down imposed agenda, but it's one where you've got people at the forefront. So things like more inclusive participatory budgeting processes, more inclusive processes of democracy, citizens' assemblies that Scotland's really making a run on would be another good example of the sorts of things you'd have in that. But also economic democracy. So I've mentioned worker co-ops. Again, that would be another example to make the economy more people-powered, more democratic. So lots of examples. But those 4 Ps, purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered, are sort of how I get my head around that suite of changes that we will need to build an economy that serves people and planet.
Oh, I hope you've all been taking notes. And for those of you who haven't got the book yet, all covered in the book. Katherine, that was amazing. You bring it to life so much better than my brain does when I'm reading it. It's just so great, the jigsaw analogy. And there's quite a lot there that comes up as you were talking, and thinking about some of the challenges that we're going through in the finance sector around the regulators wanting us to think beyond just risk and return in a financial sense, thinking about the impact that we have on the world, thinking about the climate related risks that we're facing. So, you know, that might sit in how do we prevent some of these risks? What are the opportunities, about some of the pre-distribution, and fundamentally, what is the purpose? I think one of the big things that we've got at the moment, I suppose, in not recognizing that we've arrived, it's like we've been a cog in this machine of growth, and we've become so much a part of it that we've forgotten that we're actually separate, and that the economic system and the financial system is supposed to serve a purpose rather than just, you know, grow and grow and grow. Like, as you said, you know, growth uncontrolled in some senses, you'd talk about that being cancer, for example. So there's an element of us coming back and recognizing that we are not of the system. We're like the creator of the system. And then it gives us a very different perspective. And I wondered if you see certain countries or certain industries doing this well. And I suppose I have an example in mind. So I used to work with Royal London, and they're a mutual. And I think the difference between a financial organization that is a mutual and a financial organization that is shareholder owned is so fundamental. You can feel it as soon as you start talking to people. They're proud to work there. They really clearly have a purpose. And they do undertake that kind of pre-distribution, and they look at investments not just from the risk and return perspective, but what is this creating in society? So I wonder if you can pinpoint some other examples of countries or industries that are doing particularly well.
There are so many. None of them will be perfect, probably. None of them will be this sort of perfect utopia, but they'll all be illustrations of the sort of thing we need more of. So at the country level, the two examples actually that we speak about in the book from different perspectives are Japan and Costa Rica. And so, of course, Japan infamously, in terms of the financial press, has had these lost decades of not having economic growth. But it's done okay. It's got fairly high level of life expectancy. It's relatively good on the pre-distribution conversation. It's got quite high levels of economic equality, but low levels of government tax and transfer. So it shows that the government's not having to do such a heavy lifting in ameliorating market outcomes. But Japan certainly doesn't seem to have realised that it's arrived, though there actually is quite a conversation. I would caveat that, saying there's quite a conversation in Japan around degrowth, post-growth at the moment. But Japan also has infamously as well really, really staggeringly high levels of work-related stress, even work-related suicides, pretty bad on gender inequality. And that, to me, is an example of an economy and a society that hasn't recognised it's arrived, that's really pushing to try and squeeze out more and more growth, when actually, if they were just to take their foot off the pedal and realise actually we've got enough, and how do we make the most of the resources and the wealth that they've got, and allow themselves to breathe and find their resting rhythm rather than just keeping on going. So Japan would be one example that has the possibility of recognising that that's arrived. And then from a different perspective, Costa Rica. So in GDP terms, it's a middle income country, but it's got a higher life expectancy than the US. It's got incredible levels of biodiversity, renewable energy, a very preventative health system, famously very, very high level of education amongst its citizens. And I think that, again, is a country that shows that you don't need those extraordinary high levels of GDP per capita to deliver the sort of social outcomes you want. It's seen often as a overperformer when you compare social outcomes to level of GDP per capita. And in terms of industries, I have so many examples that I often point to, and I'd actually be lovely if people wanted to put in the chat some of the examples that they see and that they interact with, whether it's the nice local social enterprise or the local community-owned bakery, that they buy their bread from, or for me, one of my favourite examples as an organisation, a business just outside Glasgow in Mulgai called Jaw Brew. So it's a beer maker, and they are really focused on making their production and consumption systems more sustainable. So really trying to capture the carbon that they use. They make a line of beer out of old bread from the nearby bakery. Their tap room is made from old pallets. So that's a small example of a business that's really trying to be more circular in its modes of operation. At the other end of that, you get an organisation like Triodos, the Dutch bank, that's a registered B Corp, really trying to put its investment and sort of do its lending to businesses and activities that are more sustainable. You get famously fairly big worker-owned cooperatives, Mondragon in the Basque region being a famous example, John Lewis, the engineering company Arup that designed the Sydney Opera House, right through then to the one I really like is over in Glasgow again. You can see my West Coast roots of Green City Whole Foods, a worker-owned cooperative that's been going in Glasgow since the 70s, where all the workers are members and they take decisions about how to make that business run in their interests rather than the interests of some remote share owner. So there's a whole plethora of examples of different businesses. And I'd also think the other piece is that even in some of the businesses we may not at first glance associate with this agenda, there's really, really good folk who are trying to work within the system, within those structures, and to deliver good outcomes. And 20 years or so ago, when I used to live in Australia, I was working with a big mining company and really trying to focus some of its activities on delivering the benefits to local communities around its mine sites. So there's a lot of it's. One of my least favourite phrases is the term "the business community," as if it's one sort of homogeneous sector. But I think, and we saw this through COVID, didn't we? You know, there is the good, the bad, and the ugly in the business community. And I'd love to hear people's ideas on, you know, organisations that they think are using commercial viability as a vehicle rather than the goal in its own right to deliver sort of outcomes that we need.
Challenge to all of you there, so get your fingers typing in the Q&A or in the chat if you've got examples that you'd like to share as well. So, Katherine, so what I've written down here is you've got this concept of you manage what you measure, and then what I've kind of written to myself is actually it's about what is the measure of success, right? And I think we've allowed this conversation about growth and the conversation about GDP to become one and the same, when in fact, in some regards, we might be talking about growth in, as you said, in other things. Yes. And I think there is the importance of language is really clear here. And I think I'm going to offer out a challenge here, which is a challenge to my previous speaker as well. So Tim Jackson, Professor Tim Jackson from the Centre for Sustainable Prosperity. No, Understanding. Prosperity. Thank you.
Yep.
Talks about post-growth. Jason Hinkle talks about degrowth. Language matters, right? And I wonder if does the word degrowth, I don't know, make people think that things that they value are going to shrink. And where are you on this? One of the questions is, how do you distinguish the economics of arrival from similar lines of thought in degrowth, steady state economy, donut economics, that kind of stuff? And I just, that language for me is a sticking point, and I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, of course. So for Jeremy and I, the idea of arrival is a much more positive, almost an invitation. Yeah. Whereas, and a lot of degrowth scholars and activists would say the beauty and the benefit of a term like degrowth is that it won't be co-opted. And it's often been described as a missile term. And so while I agree with a lot of the analysis that underpins the degrowth movement, I personally, in terms of my theory of change, the idea of a missile term, when we need people around the same table, we need bridges, not missiles. We need conversations rather than grenades. That's not the sort of tactic I want to deploy, though the analysis that underpins it is really, really sound. I think, though, as a term, it's not nuanced enough, just the same way that growth isn't nuanced enough. Because in a wellbeing economy, an economy making itself at home, there is lots we will want more of. There's lots we will want to nurture and grow, whether that's community-owned renewable energy projects, whether that's local high streets with locally owned bakeries and locally owned breweries, as I've just talked about, or whether it's sort of more beautiful or local farms. There's all the sorts of things that you can imagine at a local economy or a national economy that's thriving. What would you need more of? And so for me, this idea of perhaps being agnostic about growth is problematic. I'm really fussy about growth. It's sort of what sort of growth do we want, and how, and for whom, and where? And so as we were talking just before we came on, growth on its own is a bit of an abstract concept, like more or move. So if I was just to say to you, hey, move, you'd say, well, what do you mean? So up, down, sideways, faster, slower? You'd want more descriptors of what sort of movement you mean. And so to me, the fact that growth in and of itself is neither good or bad. It's all about what do we want more of. And so I think the idea of arrival, the idea of a well-being economy is parking that conversation and saying, let's really, really focus on what it is we want. What are the outcomes? And growth is a strategy for that rather than a goal in its own right. So it's sort of getting our sequencing right a little bit. But I absolutely agree with you. I think language really matters. And in different contexts, different words will or will not resonate. I mean, there's in Scandinavian countries, the term well-being often sort of morphs into this idea of welfare, which again, that's not what the well-being economy is about. It's about actually asking the economy to do more of the heavy lifting rather than having now more sort of government provided welfare. So understanding context really is really, really important. And the term well-being as well, I actually am so often saying, no, it's about putting the well-being in front of the economy. It's not just well-being, it's not just economy in its own right, and it's certainly not wellness, as my Google alerts seem to think it. My well-being economy tag seem every so often I get, the Hyatt has announced a new spa range or something, and delete. But this is really about what sort of economy do we need to deliver the outcomes. And this is about attending to families and communities that don't have enough. It's about making sure people have decent jobs that pay enough. It's about helping people who are struggling with bills, that it's making sure people have enough shelter. So there's a very real material basis to a lot of the components of well-being, and the idea, we're talking about Adam Smith at the beginning here, that the wealth of nations idea. There's a reason why We All Scotland has its series of conferences called Wealth of Nations 2.0, because the original meaning of the word wealth in Old English was conditions of well-being. And so this is sort of going back to what are the conditions of well-being, and often the economy has a very, very clear role to play in that. Do you have enough time? Do you have a job with dignity and purpose that pays enough? Can you put food on the table? Can you afford to do what you want and then get engaged in your community? The economy absolutely matters in that. So it's not sort of yoga or lentils or so on important, though that might be for a lot of people. It's actually saying, what is the economic basis of those conditions of well-being?
And that approach, Katherine, is so spacious. Something similar in that when we were doing Tim's book, I found that it read like music that left space for you to add a melody. And it feels like in talking about the economics of arrival, of what it means to be at home, it creates a responsive, reactive, broad spaciousness to allow the things that are important to you to change over time, which perhaps GDP or we must have growth is more prescriptive and less open to dialogue. That's something I certainly take from it. Was that intentional?
Yeah, and I mean, because the idea of making yourself at home means you're absolutely improving. You're wanting to improve your space. So and that's what Adam Smith was talking about, the economy. This is about a better quality economy, not necessarily judging it in its quantitative terms. And so I've just moved back to a home here in Canberra where it needs a lot of improvement. It's only single glazing in the windows here. So that's going to be something I'm going to have to save up to improve this house. I don't want to add another layer to it, but I absolutely want to improve it. And that's about me making myself at home in this space and really, taking care of the quality of that. And so I think that metaphor can allow for things getting better in a qualitative way rather than just getting bigger. And I think that's a shift that we need. That's when I say, being fair weather friends of growth rather than its ever faithful followers. That's the conversation that we need to really open up. And it's the sort of questions we need to ask when we hear debates about the economy in the news, amongst politicians, even amongst our friends. So those assumptions that we just grow the economy, all our problems will be solved. There's this assumption that it'll lead to poverty reduction, that it'll lead to better living standards for individuals. And growth has had its chance. We've had economic growth over the last few decades. I mean, in small percentage points, though that has been, but it hasn't led to poverty reductions for enough people in places like Scotland. It certainly hasn't trickled down to enough people. It hasn't been an automatic read across for good lives for enough people. We see living standards flatline for a lot of socioeconomic demographics. We see poverty being fairly stark. We see gaps in life expectancy rising. We see young people scared for their future. We see rising levels of loneliness and self-harm. All of that is an indictment on the 20th century recipes of the growth-orientated economy, assuming that everything else will flow across and just grow the economy and that will sort everything out. And so it's time now to turn to new recipes, to bring back, go to the root causes, create recipes that are fit for our times. And yes, that's going to be a bit experimental. There is no sort of plug and play blueprint. We're going to have to look around the world for inspiration, particularly look to First Nations communities, but also be ready to experiment and try things out and figure out what works. But I think the key thing is having that conversation with the mindset of the economy needing to serve people and planet rather than the other way around. And that's easy for me to say on a webinar like this, but it is actually a real fundamental repurposing and complete reorientation of how we think about the economy.
Let's pause on that for a moment. So, a financial system, a financial sector that serves people and the planet. What does that look like for the listeners? What does that look like for you in your job? What would need to change? So I'm going to probe you now, maybe for some thoughts on the finance sector. So in Australia, they're far ahead of the UK in terms of the pension sector and auto enrollment. They've got masses of assets in their superannuation funds. And, the UK is catching up. That's a whole swathe of money. And we talk about it at the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, and we realize that this money has a dual purpose. Yes, it's going to provide an income for many people when they retire, but really importantly, capital is creative, right? It creates the world around us. So not only does it help grow your pension pot, but it also designs, creates, and builds the world around you and determines the kind of world that you're going to retire into and spend that money in. So it has those dual purposes. And I wonder, what might you want someone from the finance sector to take from your book, from your work? And there is trepidation when I ask this, because it might cause us to question some really big fundamentals. We like our models, we like our financial theory, and growth, that little G in our little models is quite prominent. What words of wisdom do you have for us, Katherine?
So one, I'm not from the finance sector, so I'd love a dialogue with folks. I'd love people's ideas on how these realities start to percolate and how they might become manifest in people's different corners and different spheres of influence in the finance sector. But to me, the really game-changing opportunity is to imagine the finance sector as being in service of what that sort of economy needs, almost delivering the energy for a well-being economy. And that's described by a beautiful organisation, an impact investment firm called Small Giants here in Australia, based in Melbourne. And they're very, very proud of saying, we want to channel our financial investments into the sort of activities that we need more of in the new economy, or in a well-being economy. So taking a good hard look at where that opportunity, that creative aspect of finance that you described, where does that need to be deployed, and being very, very fussy, asking the right questions around how is this firm that you're wanting to invest in defining success? How is it doing its governance? Who's involved around the table in decision making? How does it do its leadership? How does it understand its community relations? Are they extractive or are they mutually orientated? What's its innovation all about? Is it to create products that make things and services that make things better for people? Or actually, is it profiting from failure demand? What sort of firms, what sort of businesses and activities is it supporting? How is it accounting for its success? How is it aligning what it measures with that vision that it talks about? How does it learn? How does it learn from each other? How does it experiment? How does it create a context where to fail maybe not be a toxic thing, but actually we can learn from that? And so for me, it's sort of what sort of questions are finance and investors asking? And then how can we channel that capital so that it is, as Tim Jackson would say, seeing investment as a commitment to the sort of economy we need more of. And that then begs questions around what sort of returns are we looking for? Are they just going to be short-term financial returns, or are they going to be returns maybe beyond financial returns? I mean, that could be a really massive question to start asking. And what sort of time scale are we looking for? Is it just those quarterly sugar hit, or is it going to be a much longer term conversation, really standing alongside an activity so it can go through that stage, but also thinking about, okay, who's getting the returns on wealth as well? And I think that's something that the finance sector needs to ask itself. To me, that's one of the big unanswered questions of the impact investing conversation is, yes, you might be doing incredible support of incredibly funky organizations that are doing great work in their immediate area. But if economic wealth is going to those who have already got economic wealth, that's exacerbating economic inequality. This is Thomas Piketty's theory. Do we have an answer for that yet? And we know how pernicious economic inequalities are. I mean, we're seeing that in all regions around the world, apart from Europe in the last few years, economic inequality is getting worse. And so how do we grapple with that? I don't have an answer for that yet, but I know some smart people are starting to work on it. So those questions around what sort of returns, what sort of questions are being asked when you look at potential recipients of investment, and what sort of timeframes matter. And I guess the other one I'd add to that is where power sits in terms of defining impact. Who defines what impact is going to be? Is it sitting in nice offices in Edinburgh, or is it actually communities around the world that are at the forefront of being impacted by climate change, for example? Is it businesses that are saying, I have a vision for how to create a different sort of economy here, and I need some financial backing to create that and get on with it and invest in the sort of equipment or activities I need to. So it's those questions that I think are really crucial. And fortunately, there's lots of people in the financial sector who are asking those questions and taking those bold decisions. I mean, that term, beyond financial returns, that's not my term. That came from a community of practice that I'm involved in, of incredible organizations in the ESG world from across Europe and North America, who are really starting to ask those very, very bold, potentially game-changing questions of themselves and of their sector. So I'm heartened that there are some real pioneers, real thought leaders, real entrepreneurs within the finance sector who are grappling with that reality, who are looking around the world and saying, we know business as usual can't carry on. How can I bring the potential of finance to be part of that positive change, as you say, that creative capability?
So good, Katherine. Thank you. Now we're getting close to time, and I've got a bunch of questions. So this is going to be a little more quick fire, and I'm going to try and ask you questions while reading questions and trying to synthesize questions. So here goes. Okay. I think the green means it's been answered a little. So there's a question here, and I think it speaks to one of the questions I had. So we've talked a little bit around identifying what we want more of, but often when I look around my room that I'm in at the moment, there's also things I want less of, right? I want less stress, I want less mess, I want stuff that needs to go to the recycling, And there's a question here, I think it's from Colin, around if you use the analogy of a plane taking off, which is economic development, and then reaching cruising altitude, which is arrival, aren't the global north countries at too high an altitude in terms of their consumption, resource use, pollution, etc.? And so don't actually these companies need to reduce altitude to release airspace for other nations? And then he's gone, there's lots of questions that come after this that you don't have to answer, but the types of questions, and I think this is like asking like a 3-year-old, right? So what about the impact on finance? What about the impact on asset values, return to capital? Does arrival really mean business as usual? Is it actually about the airspace analogy and kind of dropping altitude to allow others to come up?
Yep. Gosh, Colin, fantastic question. And you've said to me to do quick fire answers, so apologies, Colin, for rather crude answer to a very, very complicated question. And I'm happy to, if you want, to pick up this conversation offline as well. So in a short answer, yes, countries like Australia and the UK are eating up more than their fair share of ecological room. And if we're serious about global justice, we have to really take a good hard look at the amount of consumption. Of course, though, it's not all equal in countries like the UK and Australia. It's huge inequalities within countries, and there are huge inequalities in countries that on average are not eating up more than their ecological fair share, but there's very, very wealthy individuals in a lot of those countries as well. So I think looking at there's a lot of research coming out now from people like Lucas Chancel, people like Oxfam, where I used to work, looking at the consumption patterns or by income deciles rather than just looking at countries. And so examples of the policy initiatives that would start to tackle that are things like a frequent flyer tax, because it's the consumption patterns of the very wealthy that are the ones that are really driving climate breakdown. So the other piece of literature, very briefly, Colin, I'd refer to you to that you might find really useful is a contraction and convergence conversation, that we need to make room for our colleagues and friends and family members in the majority world to increase their material living standards. The sort of the idea of the right to development demands that. If we're serious about their capacity to meet their basic needs in a material sense, we have to give them the space to do that. And so that means making room for them. And so until we make ecological room, we're effectively saying those inequalities in living standards are going to stay. So it's a really, really good question, but the contraction and convergence literature you might find useful, Colin.
I think we've hit on a vein and a thread of deep feeling in the audience here. So Gillian, David, your questions kind of relate to some of the answers that Katherine has given, but really the hard-hitting questions. So comment from someone not living in the developed world, the elites all over the world are one of the biggest challenges. Talking about arrival seems to perpetuate issues rather than insisting on them needing to reduce their consumption and practice self-limitation. Hard-hitting comment, and I think you've answered that in your comments already. There are multiple comments like this, and for me that's really heartening to see that in a global ethical finance webinar we're really not scared to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the overconsumption and overproduction, which was mentioned in the latest IPCC report, and that making space for others to also arrive, to also have a home. What is it that we're doing that's stopping others from being able to create a home for themselves? I think that self-reflection is needed in developed economies. So thank you, everyone, for
what was that
comments.
horrible phrase that the chap from HSBC, was it Stuart Kirk, saying just around, who cares if Miami is underwater? And it just, these questions show that absolutely a lot of people do care about people they will never meet. People, whether it's strangers today or they're people who are yet to be born and their children. We do care because caring about each other is what makes us innately human. And thank goodness that sort of line of Stuart Kirk's, to be so arrogant and so dismissive of the rights and the livelihoods of fellow human beings. Thank goodness that that hasn't taken hold. Thank goodness that's an exception, that people do care wherever they are in whatever place, whether it's in the finance system or in running a small business or in government or in civil society. I think most people do care and want to figure out from their different spheres of influence how to make the world a better place.
Okay, so I've got a hard question now, right? This one's really hard. Okay, there's a few questions that relate to this. So we've got some people who do care and some people who blatantly say they don't care. We've got the Fed, the Bank of England, central banks, etc., politicians attached to certain ways of thinking, the value of money in a certain way. How do we change that? That's not an easy answer, and we've only got like 4 minutes. So it's a brilliant question, but how do we change that?
Yeah. So, gosh, there's a lot there. One is I do think having these conversations really, really, really matter. And I have seen, to take one example, the discussion on the role of GDP in the last 10 years really, really changed. When I first started questioning, is GDP really that useful a measure of progress? And should it have such a prominent place in how we think of success of a country? I was sort of dismissed as heretical and fluffy bunny. And now I guarantee you that most people in government, most people in business will absolutely understand, not because of me. So I'm not saying I'm saying there's any causality here, but now the conversation has moved to the extent that most people really, really get the inherent flaws in GDP and how limited it is as a proxy for progress. So it doesn't mean it's been displaced yet, but the conversation has moved on. And I think that's because of conversations that people have, bringing the evidence base, allowing ourselves to ask the question, say, well, hang on a minute, is it really that useful? What about these things that it doesn't count? What about the things that counts as good that actually are not that helpful to society? So I think just spheres of influence really, and utilising conversations and changing then the terms of the debate really matter. I think also really pointing to the fact that there is a growing, I think, momentum and commitment and buy-in to these questions and these agendas. So I'm a bit geeky in that anytime I see an opinion poll survey, I store it. And so there are so many opinion polls that show wherever you are in the world, people really want the economy to serve people. They want proactive action on climate and environmental crisis and not prioritising economic outcomes. I mean, you can take opinion polls with a grain of salt. I think you underpin that with some of the outcomes of more richer, deliberative conversations, such as citizens' assemblies that we've had in Scotland. You look at the outcomes that came from when 100 Scottish people got together over 6 weekends throughout last year to deep dive into the role of Scotland in meeting its climate responsibilities. And the ideas and the policies that they came up with were way bolder than where most politicians are prepared to go. And I think it shows that idea, well, the public's not up for it, is just an excuse. And so more ideas such as citizens' assemblies to really push the conversation where people have a chance to debate, but also just to take heart that whether you get this from neuroscience, showing when our brains light up and what makes us content, whether it's from religions, whether it's from sociology or psychology, or even just from having a conversation with your grandparents or your next door neighbour about what really matters to you, what sort of country do we need for your grandchildren to be happy, you will get very, very similar answers wherever you are in the world. And to use another phrase of Tim Jackson's, it's because these sorts of things, having sufficiency of income, having dignity, having a sense of purpose, being able to participate in society, having good relationships, being in nature, those things are the sorts of things that make us innately human. Now, what has sort of almost crowded that out and masked it is the political and economic systems that we've created. And there's this lovely phrase that maybe I'll leave you with from Francis Moore Lappy, is why is it that we have collectively created a world that none of us as individuals actually want? And so that means I think we need to turn our attention to our democratic processes and make them much more aligned with what people really want, rather than political capture that we currently see. And really rethink our economy as being in service of those outcomes that people need. And again, we could just share such great stories of examples of that happening in pockets. Yes, just in pockets at the moment, but it certainly proves, those pioneering examples prove that it's possible, proves that there is no excuse not to do this. But I know that's inadequate given their strength of vested interest, so happy to come back and talk a bit more about it another time.
That was fantastic. I don't think there is an easy answer to that one. There is, however, an answer posited from one of the participants who says, is the simple solution just more effective government policy and regulation to tackle market failure or negative externalities? I wanted to bring that in just as we close, because it's another misconception of Smith that he would have liked the market to have free rein, and that's not the case at all. He was a deep interventionist. And so absolutely being purposeful about what we want this market to deliver for us is one of the keys. It's been delightful to talk to you, Katherine. I hope everybody at the webinar has really enjoyed the conversation. If you Google Katherine Trebeck and the economics of arrival, you will find loads more on the internet. There's also some great other podcasts of when she was setting up the Wellbeing Alliance, and the consistency of thought is amazing. Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So please do Google that. And I look forward to future conversations. We've run out of time. Thank you so much, Katherine.
Thanks so much. It's been really fun. Take care, everyone.